So just a couple days ago, I saw a meme pop up on social media, and it had to do with a speech that came from Stephen Miller. It's this one right here. Now, I read this quote, and I thought there's no way somebody in public office would give a speech that was connected with that level of blatant rhetorical dehumanization. Well, I mean, it's Stephen Miller, so the bar is already incredibly low, but this is from an actual speech. So what I want to do is show you 2 minutes of this speech, including the quote above, and then I'm going to go through and I'm going to show how when Stephen Miller is talking to people about the authoritarian threat to freedom, to morals, to civilization that he attributes to Antifa, he, in utilizing the state to do what he has done here, actually represents the exact same threat. So he is saying that all of these issues caused by the political left are going to cause you to lose your freedoms, your families, your morals. It's an existential threat to the West. Meanwhile, his rhetoric is exactly the same kind of authoritarian dehumanization that is used to commit the very crimes that he attributes to the political left. Here's the clip.
It's not a coincidence that when you look at these violent Antifa demonstrations, you see any photograph of those who were assembled. To be blunt, not one of the people that is demonstrating looks like a normal person. Not one looks normal. They're all deformed in some way in their appearance, in their dress, in their mannerism. Why is that? Why, if you look at two photographs and you see a normal American street, you see an Antifa protest, why do the people that are violently demonstrating, why is there not one normal-looking person among them? Every one of them, through the course of their life and their decisions, has scarred their body and their appearance in many different ways to the point in which their outer appearance becomes a manifestation of their inner hatred. Trust your instincts. To all people and across all civilizations, you know what normal is. You know what beautiful is. You know what good is. You know that families are right. You know that children are precious and beautiful and must be protected. You know that the criminal and the junkie and the predator is a threat to normal, healthy living. This is so much deeper than issues about taxation and regulation, although they're incredibly important. It's about normal, healthy, ordered living. And the violent leftists, for these deep-seated reasons, going back to the earliest wisdom taught to us in the Bible about coveting. And I'm not talking about rich versus poor. I'm talking about a much deeper kind of coveting. Coveting people who are morally superior, who are superior in the simple, truthful way they live their lives. People that they look at who are happy and ordered and peaceful and contributing to the communities. That burns an ember in them, and that's how you end up with the horrors we've seen throughout history, where good families are dragged out into the street and executed. And you might say, it's not a coincidence that...
So going on, I'm going to reference other direct quotes from earlier in his speech, because I'm not going to take the time to make clips out of everything, right? It just takes too much time. But you can find the speech, and I'll probably put a link to it here down below. But I want you to think about what he just said and then take a step back, okay? And just in your head, remove his references to Antifa and the amalgamous left. And instead, if you agree with what he's saying, I want you to replace those titles with any other cultural group, okay? Imagine that this was language coming from the Biden administration about right-wing Christian activists, okay? And then see how that language tastes. Pretend that this was language coming from the Obama administration, dehumanizing and creating feelings of revulsion and fear, and going after the appearance of abortion protesters, okay? Or, anybody else. If you remove the target group and replace the language with another group, then you can see just how vile and disruptive this language is. This is textbook authoritarian dehumanization, okay? And this is a central feature of authoritarian rhetoric throughout history. and it is the intentional creation of an internal enemy, a group portrayed not as political opponents or fellow citizens with different ideas or people that need to be reasoned with, but as a civilizational threat, a dangerous force threatening the survival and identity of the society itself. Okay? One only needs to go back and read books like The Black Book of Communism or Rise and Fall of the Third Reich or any other writings on authoritarian governments during the 20th century to see exactly where Miller's language and rhetoric falls directly in line with the very same propaganda, manipulation, and rhetoric that he claims to oppose. He is using the same methods of destruction and societal chaos development that the left uses, that he claims the left represents. This rhetorical transformation of political or societal opposition into civilization identity threats serves a very important political function. Okay? If a government or a political movement can persuade its citizens that a particular group of people, the bourgeoisie, the Jews, gypsies, antifa, black people, Hispanics, anybody, represents an existential threat, then extraordinary measures against that group become easier to advocate for and justify. And Stephen Miller's speech repeatedly uses this framework over and over and over again. So rather than limiting his criticism to specific acts of violence committed by specific individuals involved with specific movements, he constructs a very broad ideological enemy whose members are described as deceptive, as psychologically damaged, as morally corrupt, and fundamentally hostile to civilization, the civilization that him and his righteousness and the correctness of his movement is the only bulwark against. The rhetorical pattern follows a very recognizable sequence, okay? First, identify an enemy. 2, remove their legitimacy, which he does. 3, dehumanize them, create fear, and then justify expanded authority to confront the perceived threat. If you don't believe me, go back and watch his speech or read his speech and apply that pattern, even if you agree with him. One of the first examples that appear in his speech is Miller states, he says, left-wing political terrorism seeks as its ultimate end to overthrow our system and form of government. Okay? This is an example of him invoking the existential threat. Okay? This is threat framing. Every political movement contains disagreements, conflicts, and sometimes extremists. And this is even true on the right. He's making these arguments while ignoring the fact that white supremacy and white nationalism is growing, and white nationalism actually has a track record for killing people. 4,500 people in the 20th century were hanged and lynched. But he's ignoring that to focus on Antifa. Democratic societies attempt to separate individual crimes from the broader political context. Okay? However, the existential threat framing he moves into here takes all these cases and collapses the distinctions. It coalesces into one broad identity, one broad brush. The message becomes not that certain individuals have committed crimes, but that entire ideological movements represent a fundamental danger to the nation itself when those ideological movements are allowed to speak and exercise their rights. This is important because in framing opposition in such an extreme way, it changes what appears to be a reasonable response. If opponents are merely wrong, then democratic debate is appropriate. If opponents are portrayed as existential enemies, then emergency measures appear justified, which is what we're seeing right now with the violence associated with ICE. Political theorists who study authoritarian movements, including people like Jason Stanley, who wrote a very, very good book entitled How Fascism Works, have identified this pattern as a recurring feature in fascistic politics. And I usually don't use the F word, but what Stephen Miller does here is fascistic, okay? 1, Your opponents are transformed from merely being competitors with different ideas into enemies whose existence is framed as a threat to your family's survival. And he does. Miller does invoke the idea of the perfect family here later as well. One of the most significant rhetorical devices that he utilizes here is disease imagery. Okay? He describes political violence as something that can fester as a cancer. And this is the political violence and the opposition to political ideas, festering as a cancer, and ultimately will destroy society. Now, disease metaphors are historically powerful. They are very powerful because they change the way a listener conceptualizes their political opponents. A political opponent, somebody who's coming at you with different ideas, can be debated. And you can lose a debate, right? They can be they must be persuaded. They must be defeated in an election or negotiated with. That is what political opposition is. A disease, however, is something that must be removed by force, something you have to take direct action against. Diseases must be eliminated or contained. And this is why authoritarian movements throughout history have often described enemies as parasites, as viruses, as infections, as cancer, or as Trump has said, immigration poisons the blood of our nation. The purpose is not simply to insult the opposition. The purpose is to change the moral category of the target you are speaking about. A person described as a political opponent remains somebody with rights, dignity, and the ability to speak. A person described as a disease becomes something that society must eliminate for its own survival. That's what Miller does here. Hannah Arendt's work on totalitarianism examined how authoritarian movements transform groups of people into objective enemies. People portrayed not as dangerous because of what specific individuals or specific smaller groups of individuals may have done, but rather her work shows us that people were transformed into enemies because of what they supposedly are. Okay? Another important element of Miller's speech is his blatant and straightforward denial that opponents act from a position of sincere beliefs. In the paragraph before the clip, Miller states very specifically, he says, let's not pretend for a moment that these radical leftists, these terrorists, are operating from a place of sincere political conviction. Okay? So right there is an act of delegitimization. Okay? They can't possibly be sincere because they don't agree with us, right? This is a classic propaganda technique to deny the legitimacy of your opponent's motives in a way that pits a classic us versus them. They can't be realistic. They can't be sincere. Because if they were sincere, realistic, rational, or honest, they would agree with us. The United States, as a democratic republic, depends upon the idea that people can disagree sincerely, even when that sincerity escalates into passionate protest and sometimes even violence, which we have seen a lot of throughout U.S. history. So citizens from different regions, different areas, are going to come out all issues with different experiences, with different moral priorities, different cultural experiences, different perspectives, different cultural conditioning, and different ways of interpreting history while still participating in the exact same political community. And all that matters is they can come at things from different perspectives all day long as all parties still agree upon the basic civic principles of the Constitution. And that's the difference between civic patriotism, which is constitutional, and nationalistic patriotism, which is tied to identity, race, and whatnot. So Miller is tied to nationalistic identity, not civic principles. So Miller replaces this idea with the assumption that opponents are not genuinely motivated by beliefs that come from the aggregate of their experience, but rather they are motivated by deception or manipulation or jealousy or psychological defense or hatred. Once opponents are assumed to be acting in bad faith. The second you attribute malice before you look for understanding, there is little reason to debate them. They are no longer citizens to be persuaded, but a problem that has to be managed to maintain control. This same pattern appears elsewhere in the speech, where Miller describes supporters of the political left or those who support anti-fascist movements as useful idiots, which is interesting. When he said this, I laughed out loud, because here he is railing against what he calls leftist threats by utilizing a term that is historically attributed to communist leadership like Vladimir Lenin, okay? And the term useful idiots is specifically deployed to describe people who are manipulated by the state to support the goals and agendas of a political movement while believing that they are actually acting independently or for another cause, which I would argue is exactly what Stephen Miller is doing with this speech. He is manipulating people to support a cause by giving them manipulated misinformation and fear-stoking, and giving them enemies to hate, all for the purpose of advancing his ideological goals, okay? So Miller is doing precisely what he claims he hates about the left again. But anyway, the phrase useful idiot creates a hierarchy within the opposing group, okay? Leaders are portrayed as malicious manipulators, okay? Driven by malice, hatred, jealousy, whatever. While their ordinary supporters are portrayed as deluded, foolish individuals who have been deceived and just flat don't know what they're doing. Either way, nobody within the opposing movement is granted any genuine intellectual independence. They have to be downplayed, diminished, demeaned, dehumanized, and dismissed. And that's what Miller does here. The possibility that people might support certain political ideals because of sincere moral concerns, because of differential experiences, understandings of history, interpretations of fact, personal experiences, is simply dismissed. Miller then moves from questioning the sincerity of opponents to attacking their personal character. And this is where the clip I showed you comes in. He says that the leftist is fundamentally motivated by envy, by hatred, by jealousy. So rather actually engaging with political arguments and ideas, he chooses to go after what he sees as hidden physiological motives. And this is a specific example of demonization and dehumanization. And instead of asking whether an idea is correct or incorrect, the speech encourages listeners to behave that people holding an idea are driven by some sort of moral, physiological, or spiritual defect. This tactic has been deployed historically because it makes opposing arguments absolutely unnecessary to consider at all. You don't have to take them seriously. If someone supports a policy because they are motivated by justice or compassion, then their arguments must be addressed and taken seriously. However, if they support it because they are driven by envy, by resentment, by hatred, then their ideas can simply be dismissed without examination because they are coming from a place of malice, okay? Not thought, not character, not integrity, not desire, but just simply hatred. One of the most effective sections of Miller's speech is where he contrasts the hatred and the moral depravity of the left with his description of the perfect family with a perfect life, a perfect job, and perfect kids, and, of course, regular church attendance. This passage is important because it does not begin with politics. It begins with something that people on the political left and the political right deeply value: family, safety, faith, children, stability, and belonging. And he acts as if those on the left with family and children don't value these things. Rather, he attributes to them everything that is backwards. Only after establishing this, emotional, powerful imagery, this 1950s Ward Cleaver concept, right, with everybody walking down the street hand in hand with their perfect family to their perfect Protestant church, does he introduce the enemy. He argues that leftists look at this life, this idealized 1950s standard, with jealousy, and they feel inadequate. This is a form of symbolic threat construction. The audience, his listeners, are encouraged to see political opponents again, not merely as people with different views, but as people who resent and seek to destroy the things that they love the most. Leftists and their ideas are not only a threat to government policy, but to your children, to your home, to your job, and to your perfect Protestant community. This technique is historically significant because political movements seeking to mobilize fear often frame political threats to home, family, religion, or national identity. As a matter of fact, that was the entire cause of the Ku Klux Klan, who railed against communism in protection of family and home. This right here. The emotional sequence becomes, this is what we value, this is what makes life meaningful, this is the enemy who wants to take it away. The speech then makes another rhetorical leap by arguing that these emotions inevitably lead to oppression and violence. Ironically, he doesn't seem to realize that his rhetoric also leads to oppression and violence. But Miller claims that envy, hatred, ultimately produce the desire to subjugate, to oppress, to inflict pain and suffering. Often enough, people who have been manipulated by arguments of dehumanization also resort to subjugation, oppression, and the infliction of pain and suffering. In this framework, the problem is no longer specific actions committed by specific individuals who've committed crimes and need to be brought to justice. The problem is the supposed nature of an entire ideological group that must be destroyed or rooted out or confronted. This is the process of collective demonization. The group is not portrayed as dangerous because certain individuals may carry actions too far or engage in violent behavior. Rather, an entire group of people is portrayed as dangerous merely because its members allegedly possess the same corrupt internal motivations. Now, the most extreme example of this demonizing and dehumanization or rhetoric occurs in the clip I showed you. And in that clip, Miller discusses the physical appearance of leftist and Antifa protesters. He states that not one of the people that is demonstrating looks like a normal person. And by normal person, I'm going to assume he means that perfect family with a perfect job in a church pew. The claim that they are deformed and that their outward appearance reflects their inner hatred, that's what he's driving for here. This is significant because it goes beyond arguments about policy, about politics, about disagreement, and beyond behavior, and moves into the realm of essential personal identity. He suggests that moral corruption can be seen physically. Now, this is an argument from eugenics, okay? 19th century eugenics. It is the discredited concept of physiognomy, which claimed that a person's appearance reveals their inner character. And it was used to put people in insane asylums, perform lobotomies, and carry out all kinds of cruelty. I'm convinced that Trump and his administration are a eugenics movement. But anyway, throughout history, ideas have been used to justify discrimination by portraying certain groups of people as naturally dangerous, inferior, or corrupt. The fact that the political right is allowing eugenics arguments to take place is astonishing. The rhetorical effect is powerful because it replaces evidence with prejudice and instinct. Instead of encouraging the audience to examine what people believe, what they say, or the basis of their philosophy, or what actions individuals have taken, Miller encourages his audiences to believe that they can simply recognize evil or social contagion by the appearance of an individual from a different culture or community or background. This is why Miller tells people to trust your instincts. The message is that judgment does not require investigation, engagement, curiosity, debate, or honesty, because truth is supposedly visible through the through the physical deformation that these people's ideas bring. The speech uses emotionally charged language associated with disgust, with cancer, with infestation, with deformity, with scarredness, with predators, with junkie and hatred. That is the language he utilizes to manipulate you. Those are not neutral political descriptions. They are emotional triggers designed to create revulsion in you and manipulate your behavior and your attitudes towards targeted groups. Many political psychologists like Martha Nussbaum have written fairly extensively about the political power of disgust, okay? Which is what Miller does here. Disgust is different from fear because it does not merely suggest that somebody is dangerous. Rather, it suggests that somebody is a contamination, that they are beneath consideration or outside the bounds of normal moral concern. If you are revolted by somebody, you will not take them seriously. You want to be as far away from them as possible. Now, fear can produce caution and does produce caution. Disgust produces exclusion, prejudice, and the active moments to create groups. Miller's repeated use of the concept of normal performs a very similar function. When he states, you know what normal is, he creates an implied distinction that is drawn from your biases and your experiences to build a wall between those who naturally belong to what you see as common and those who represent disorder. Normality, he then takes and becomes associated with a very specific, very narrow idea of family, religion, tradition, stability, and social conformity. Those outside that definition are portrayed as abnormal, as damaged, as threatening. This is a very common feature of authoritarian rhetoric. Societies are divided between those who are presented as ideal, as healthy members of the community, and those who are presented and propagandized as unhealthy elements that threaten the social order. Okay? If you look at Puritan communities, they would cast people out because they were wrong. They would whip them, and they hung and murdered several people because of their threat to the social order. The conflict is no longer framed as a disagreement of ideas over policy. It becomes a struggle between those who are perceived and labeled as healthy and those who are perceived and healthy as corrupt, regardless of their actual identity. The religious language in the speech pushes us even further. By invoking the biblical concept of coveting, Miller frames political disagreement as a moral and spiritual struggle, which is, again, tied back to the white Christian identity movements that ultimately killed 4,000 or more people and actually carried out campaigns of terror during the 20th century. His opponents are not merely advocating for different ideas. They are perceived as people consumed by sinful, dangerous emotions. They are unclean, okay? This process transforms politics into a form of moral or spiritual warfare where compromise becomes ultimately difficult because compromise can appear to be surrendering truth itself. Now, the final escalation in what Miller lays out connects these ideas with alleged psychological and moral defects, which he then ties to historical atrocities. He warns about families being dragged into the streets and executed. He invokes some very powerful emotional imagery, again, from authoritarian movements in the 20th century. The audience is led through a very carefully constructed, emotional, manipulated progression. Political disagreement becomes psychological pathology. Pathology becomes a moral corruption. Moral corruption becomes deformity, becomes hatred, becomes jealousy. Okay? And that moral corruption then becomes hatred of family and goodness. And eventually, that hatred becomes mass violence. That is his construction. That is his manipulation. That is his dehumanization that he lays out here. This is a form of catastrophizing. It encourages people to interpret the current political conflicts as the beginning of an inevitable historical and social disaster, which, by the way, is what Karl Marx laid out from the opposite side in his works. Once society is convinced that it faces an existential crisis, which is what Marx chalked up to the bourgeoisie, extraordinary actions become easier to defend. When you take all of this together, Miller's rhetoric follows a very recognizable pattern. First, a broad enemy group is identified, and that group's legitimacy is then denied. Their motives are assumed to come from a place of malice and therefore corrupt and do not need to be engaged. Their members are depicted as abnormal, as dangerous, as threats. Emotional disgust and fear are cultivated to keep you from listening or to identify this group. The threat is then connected with the audience's deepest values: your family, your faith, your safety, and even your civilization. And finally, the argument is presented that the state does not need to take these seriously, and expanded power is presented as necessary for protection. The concern with this type of rhetoric is not that governments should ignore violence. Political violence must be investigated and prosecuted regardless of ideology, which is why the Trump administration's pardon of people involved in the January 6th riots is so disgusting, because they are going after one group for committing acts of violence while ignoring the acts on their own side. The concern is the movement from holding individuals accountable for specific actions that will portray entire groups of citizens as inherently dangerous because of their political identity. Okay? A democratic republic that we live in requires a difficult but essential distinction. People can be wrong without being evil. They can support ideas we oppose without being enemies of society. They can be political opponents without being identity or existential threats. When that distinction disappears, when the state publishes a speech like this, which draws on rhetorical elements designed to dehumanize, delegitimize, and dismiss, disagreements become warfare. Your opponents no longer your neighbors, they are now your enemies. And the constitutional protections that we have quickly become viewed as obstacles to state action rather than safeguards to protect individuals. History shows us that democratic decline begins not only with changes to laws and institutions, but rather with changes in how citizens see each other. When political opponents are portrayed as diseased, as abnormal, as corrupt, as fundamentally hostile, as diminished, as deformed, as spiritually bankrupt, the societal foundation that allows democracy to function automatically is weakened. The language Miller uses to describe opponents shapes who is considered a neighbor. It shapes who is considered a threat. And ultimately, it goes on to shape and diminish who is considered worthy of equal rights, whose speech is legitimate, and who is allowed to engage within a political community. If you agree with Stephen Miller, you need to check your moral compass. America is a very big place, and the idea that the state allows a man like this, whose rhetoric echoes and even advances some of the very, very worst, bottom of the barrel dehumanization and political tactics and manipulation that have led to the deaths of literally millions on both sides of the political spectrum, should shame you. You need to check your moral compass.